The only area that they've watered down is if you're wanting to do cyber security. Have you been hacking anything, Tim?
All that and more on today's Mixture of Experts. Good morning, I'm Tim Hwang, and welcome to Mixture of Experts. Each week, MOE brings together a group of the sharpest thinkers working in artificial intelligence to walk you through the week's news. On this week's episode, we have an all-star cast: Kaoutar Maghraoui, Principal Research Scientist, AI Platforms; Volkmar Uhlig, CTO, VP Data Platforms; and Chris Hay, Distinguished Engineer. Welcome to you all. It's great to see everybody. We've got three big stories that we're going to cover today. Some really interesting announcements coming out of Apple's WWDC, a fun study coming out about AI sarcasm. But of course, I want to start today with the news that's on everybody's lips, which is the release of Fable V. So if you've been living under a rock, the news here is that Anthropic has announced a sort of watered down release of its much touted Mythos model. It's being made available across the board for a limited period of time. And a lot of people are out there and using it. And, Chris, maybe I'll start with you. I was just complaining, I think a month or two ago. I was like, I'm so bored of all these new model releases. What's the difference between all these model releases? It's, yawn, yawn, yawn. It's so boring. This one really seems to have gotten people excited in a way that they haven't in quite a long time. And I guess question for you, Chris, is like, is there anything new here, or is this just hype?
I mean, first thing, Tim, you said watered down. This is not a watered down Mythos model. If you actually look at the benchmarks for a second, it's actually better. The only area that they've watered down is if you're wanting to do cyber security. Have you been hacking anything, Tim? Or if you're trying to design biological weapons, are you up to anything at the weekend, Tim? Or if you're trying to create your own frontier model as an AI researcher. So the only way it's watered down, Tim, is if you're doing one of those three tasks. Which one is it? Shall I call the authorities?
None, actually, which is good news. But I guess when you see these benchmarks, I don't know, and Chris, I'm sure you've played around with it as well. How's the vibe check? Like, do you feel like the capabilities here are step function more? Any interesting observations so far there?
Yeah, no, it is a complete step change against other models. And I think the first thing I would say is that, I've spent quite a long time playing with Fable at the moment, and it is genuinely a great model. It is genuinely a step up. The first thing I would say is its long-term planning capabilities are far superior. So you can run, so if you're doing coding tasks for etc., it is just going to go for longer, and it's going to cover a lot more kind of files in that sense. The other one, the ability for it to stitch things up within the context, again, is much, much better. I would have said in the earlier models, things like Opus, for example, it wouldn't get so much of the nuances. So things like discovering what bugs you have in your code, what particular issues you've got going on, things that you've never really thought about in that sense. It's got such a deeper analysis. Weirdly enough, it's faster, and I can't work that out because I know it's a much bigger model. So I don't know if they're running it on the SpaceX chips and it's not going as fast as it's going faster than the Opus ones, but it's definitely feeling faster, which doesn't kind of compute in my brain. The other one is things like spatial awareness. So if you've done things like diagramming on it, for example, or if you try and create some games or whatever, its ability to be spatially aware and write code that's not overlapping, etc., I think is a lot better. So I genuinely think, especially from a coding perspective, this is a massive step up from the previous models. And I think when June the 22nd or whenever it is comes around and suddenly money has to leave my wallet, I'm gonna cry because I'm not sure I can go back.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about June 22nd, and Kaoutar, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what you think is going on under the hood from an infrastructure standpoint. There's a really interesting thing they're doing, and it's actually a little bit confusing. So buried at the bottom of all of these benchmarks, there's a little section in their blog post announcing this called availability. And they basically say from today, the launch date, to June 22nd, Fable's going to be included on all of the subscriptions. But then afterwards, we're gonna pull it away, and you're gonna have to pay us for usage credits. And then they say, after this point, when sufficient capacity allows us to do so, we aim to restore Fable V as a standard part of the subscription plans. So it's gonna appear, disappear, and then maybe reappear again. What's going on there?
Yeah, there is like some interesting things happening here, and of course, the like uh the numbers are great, the benchmarks, but I think what's the real interesting part here is how they're doing all these routing behind the scenes, and also the backlash that they had. So one thing, there were some three complaints, after the launch. First, it burns through your usage scary fast. One person, on the 200-month, plan reported a single task at their entire 5-hour usage window without, even finishing. So it burned, all their 5-hour usage, and it didn't even finish. And also, it can secretly make itself worse, but I think they made some changes there. And I think that's a spicy one, because normally when Fable hits, a block topic, it tells you and has the question to the weaker Opus model. But there is a hidden fourth category. If it thinks you're doing frontier AI research, building model training pipelines, distributed training, or designing AI chips, initially I think it didn't refuse, and it doesn't even tell you. It just keeps answering as if all is normal, but quietly degrading the quality of its help under the hood. And I think that there was a big backlash. And I think they apologized. I think they had the conversation with Wire where,
Yeah, I think it was
they,
news actually last night that they were
yes, it
backing off
was
this
just,
position a little bit. Yeah.
reversed within 20 hours. And, after the backlash, the Anthropic told Wired that it's changing the frontier research safeguard to be visible. And they apologized, saying, like, we made the wrong trade-off, and we apologize for not, getting the right balance right here. So the catch here, it's making it visible means applying also it more broadly. So it'll now block more harmless queries too. And, so I think, the real story here is this tier things that they're doing. So because, when the restricted methods first shipped in April, unauthorized users, reportedly also got into it anyway. And that was kind of a bad look for a company like whose whole brand is we gate the dangerous stuff responsibly. So I think, from what I see this, I think a lot of people are fixating on the benchmark scores. And yes, Fable is remarkable. It did like 2 months of engineering in a day. But as someone, I think, like who lives in the hardware and systems world, it's not what really jumps out at me. What jumps out is that the most important design choice in this whole release isn't the model at all. It's the router sitting in front of it, deciding question by question whether to use the big expensive brain or quietly fall back to a cheaper, safer one. And that's tiered route, and I think that's really important. And that's the exact same logic we use when we match a workload to the right accelerator instead of throwing the biggest chip at everything. So to me, kind of the real headline here is the frontier labs are kind of quietly admitting that one giant model for everything is too expensive and too risky to just hand out. And the race kind of shifting from whose model is smartest to whose model can you actually trust and afford to run. And I think that's a far more interesting race than, and honestly, even better one for a company like IBM. We also like think very deeply about these tiered approach, in our infrastructure.
Yeah. Volkmar, do you want to jump in? I know you spend a lot of time thinking about this. And yeah, I feel like this is the conflict I see playing out with this kind of like strange availability model and then them downshifting you if they detect that you're doing quote unquote dangerous things. It feels like there's kind of this very mixed set of incentives where Anthropic is like, because of safety, we're going to shift you the cheaper model. Also, capacity is not sufficient to serve the best model at all times. I guess how do you navigate all this? Like, do you think that this is going to just become the new norm where you just will not have guaranteed access to the top model when you work with some of these frontier companies?
So I think there will be there are a couple of things later in this question, right? So the first question is, the very first statement about who's watching the Watchmen. Right. So we effectively now have a company which decides what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do, what answers they give you and where they lie. I managed to get Claude into a corner where it admitted to me that it was intentionally lying to me. And then at that moment, I was able to extract what the rule set was. So it's programmed in to lie and to direct you to different answers. And so now the question is, who writes that rule set? And that's a really scary part, right? So we centralize to a private organization what lies shall be spread and what truth shall be told, right? And now the next step is then to say, well, I give you a good model, and you assume that you're working with a good model, and then you are slightly drifting into a worse model where we, lobotomize the quality of the answer. So those ones are, from my perspective, very questionable, and I think there will be probably a backlash. Now, this could be done by saying, okay, I'm paying for it, I'm paying up, I want to get highest quality. And so I think exposing knobs to the user, either through prompts to allow or disallow fallbacks, would be an option, right? So that that if you're paying for something, you actually get the quality you're expecting, and otherwise people will start reverse engineering it, and you're already seeing Git pages which contain, like, here are all the prompts to jailbreak a model, right? And so people will start doing the reverse engineering. So make it explicit and make it available. So that's one. The second one is, I think that from a business perspective, and Anthropic wants to go public, they need to figure out how to get to profitability. And if you look at the they want to make their filing good, and they want to see good profitability and a path to sustainable profits. And so I think if you look at the last couple of months, all the motions they did looks like, oh, we have an S1 filing up, and we need to show that we can actually create profit margins. And so they pulled all the levers, right? It's like, sorry, you cannot use Claude-P anymore, so you cannot run a command line.
It's time to make money.
Yeah, it's time to. So they're effectively constraining everything, and everything they take away is when you start actually using it at scale, when you're trying to automate your processes. So they're like, the thing that you kind of get for a flat rate is when a human sits in front of a keyboard, and everything which is automation, we now suddenly need to pay for. And I think economically, for the company, makes a lot of sense. I think it's finally at the point where we're looking at the true cost of AI and not anymore at the Silicon Valley subsidized cost of AI. And so now suddenly we are at a point where we can actually make rational economic decisions, right? And going down the route of saying, okay, we need to route between cheap and expensive models, it's kind of logical. Now the question, and I think, Kaoutar just said that it will be a race who has the best router, because this is an economic decision. So you don't want to really lobotomize the model and make it really bad. And so you need to have a good judgment call where you actually need a better model versus where you can fall back to a dumber model or less competent model. And I think that, and so from my perspective, I look at the last 2 years. I mean, we've been on this podcast for a long time now. We went from, hey, we need to fine tune, to now we actually have programmable models, and the programmability is effectively almost the models are subroutines, and I pick which subroutine I'm calling. So the programmability went away from fine tuning towards, we just put an agentic loop around the whole thing.
Chris, you went off mute. Do you want to get a final comment here? And I think this last theme, which is very interesting, is like, we've been living in la la land as far as machine intelligence goes. Now we're going to really see the costs. And I think I saw a study from Citadel, I think the financial firm, showing that like token consumption might actually be kind of declining as people confront the costs of all this in actuality. I don't know, Chris, if you want to respond to all that.
I think I don't want to face reality. I like La La Land. I can burn 1 billion tokens.
Well, none of us do. I mean,
I max out my Claude Pro Max every week, right? I get the my hand shakes whenever I'm at 80% rather than 95% towards the end of the week there. So I can't afford my token bill. So you know what? The Silicon Valley, token La La Land needs to continue. But I do want to pick up on a more serious point, which is I actually don't think they're lobotomizing the model. And I think there is actually a serious point in there. They're just saying they're routing it, for certain types of queries, they're routing it down to Opus 4.8. And I think that's okay, because if we really think about it, what Anthropic has been saying is that they are using the Mythos-class models themselves to train their own AI. That's the big thing they've been touting for however long. And therefore, you know what? If you've got your own researchers using your AI model, where therefore it's got some of their IP within there so that they can actually train the best models, then I don't think it's so unreasonable for them to gate those requests and push it down to a model that doesn't necessarily have that IP in there. And it's not that 4.8 is a terrible model. It's a great model, right? It's just that, they don't want you going creating a Mythos-class model with their model. And I don't think that's unreasonable. Similarly, I don't think it's unreasonable for them to go, don't create chemical weapons or do DNA splicing or cybersecurity. I'm okay with this.
I disagree on two things. Okay, so my son, is like, he's 17 and he was doing biology stuff, and he's like, describe the human heart. And I was like, sorry, I cannot answer that question. Okay, when we are at 11th grade biology questions, which cannot be answered anymore, it's lobotomized, and it's like, this is beyond, like, it's like literally, describe the human heart. Sorry, can't answer. So that's just stupid, right? So the second one is, we are going, like, every company was training a foundation model went to the internet and sucked down 2,000 years of or 1,000 years of human writings, okay, and just trained it in and said, copyright, that's not for us, okay. And now we are going and turning around and saying, oh well, but if my IP is in the model, you cannot use it because my IP is important. Everybody else's IP we just stomp on, okay. And so you cannot, it's either hypocrisy or you cannot have it both ways. So either you pay everybody you train your model on, or you give access. And now, of course, they can play that game, and they have a technology to play the game. But the question is it, is it ethical and is it legal? And those are two different questions, right? And it may even be legal, but is it ethical? Probably not. So, and I think they have to face that music at some point, because you cannot have it both ways.
I think it's okay to try to protect your IP, but making it invisible, I don't think that is, the right thing to do here. Silently rewriting your prompt. And it feels like it's a man-in-the-middle attack on your own requests without knowing it. That is not okay from my perspective. I think Anthropic here having these guardrails, like one of them is about, kind of protecting the end users, like the chemical weapons and things like that. But, the other one clearly is stopping a rival, an actor, who is maybe in an adversarial country, trying to using Fable to help train a competitor model, using distillation or something like that. So not letting a frontier model meaningfully speed up the building of the next frontier model. So kind of this recursive self-improvement, and why, that's, I think the motivation why they have, these guardrails. But still, at least you need to know what's going on and not having your prompts be rewritten. They can be stopped, but they cannot, silently go and give you the wrong answers.
Well, I'm going to move us on to our next topic, but this is a fire discussion. Needless to say, we are not at the end of this, and I think the model companies will continue to do it. So we'll have a chance to revisit this controversy going forwards. Next, I actually really want to cover interesting sort of announcements coming out of Apple's WWDC, which is its annual developer conference. And I think one story I want to focus on particularly with Kaoutar, you on the panel today, and Volkmar, you on the panel today, was this kind of interesting sort of sly announcement that Apple made on the side. Apple, as your listeners will know, has really kind of touted its sort of on-device compute and privacy-enhancing architecture as one of its main selling points. What are you paying this huge premium for? You're paying for like their proprietary hardware and also the ability to kind of do it all sort of on device. And so I think one of the really interesting announcements was that it sounds like they're maybe backing off that a little bit, right? They're going to use Gemini to kind of train models that are specifically for features on device. But they are now admitting that they're going to be sending some AI requests to the cloud. I think they've kind of made the announcement that they're sort of working with NVIDIA to make sure it is still privacy enhancing. But I think this is a big shift, right? This is kind of, again, a little bit maybe a parallel to what we're talking about with Anthropic, which is you're sort of seeing a move to say, okay, well, we're not going to do everything on device and some things are going to go to cloud, but it will be private in the cloud. Volkmar, you had a good comment on this, so maybe I'll give you the first comment on like why this is happening and why Apple would back off this kind of big commitment that they made, not too long ago.
So Apple made, if you go all the way back to when Apple announced AI on the phone, it was like we run it on the device and we go into the cloud if we have to because we need more powerful models. And the architecture on device and the architecture on the cloud was the same. So they took their Apple chips and Apple Silicon and put them in the cloud. If you look at the technological requirements for running a very large scale model, is you need memory bandwidth, because you need to load the weights over and over through from the memory into the chip. And if you look at Apple Silicon, you are at the highest end, I think at 800 gigabytes a second. If you look at NVIDIA, the Blackwell chips, you're at 8 terabytes. So they are 10 times faster. And so the efficiency you get from that is just so massive. And if you think about it, it effectively delays your next token by a factor of 10. And so the speed you get, you can only achieve right now today with today's memory technology if you have high bandwidth memory. There's not a single chip which Apple produces which has HBM. And so they have to go to NVIDIA. And so I think that there was, a year or 2 years ago, we all thought, hey, small models is going to win, you fine-tune them, etc. I think, the history now going back is really frontier models, really large models are currently the winning quality, like highest quality models. And so you need to run on hardware which is made for that. And the Apple Silicon is just not. Now, NVIDIA supports confidential compute. So you have all the way encrypted, the PCI bus is encrypted, what's on the card is encrypted, so you cannot even sniff it. And so you can actually establish a trusted compute zone. And so I think what Apple is doing is saying, okay, let's take what we have with what we did for the Apple chip, which we fully control, and just transpose that over and run the same fundamental architecture on NVIDIA hardware and use the security features that are built in. So it's not surprising. I don't think it's a major shift. I think it's primarily, okay, we don't want to build high bandwidth memory into our chips because that's not their target market. They are not building high-end graphics adapters or high-end AI processors. They're building kind of, consumer devices, and they're not in the server market. So going to a third-party vendor like NVIDIA is kind of a logical conclusion. Now, the second one, the question you asked about Gemini, and I think Apple kind of, while they had a good start and a good story to tell, I think they really failed in execution. I remember back when they initially announced it, I said, it's kind of the logical place to do it. And we are now at a point where Apple says, okay, yeah, we really cannot train a model. Let's take one from Google.
Yeah, and I think, Kaoutar, I guess maybe two questions here, but we'll start with the first one is, do you kind of read this the same way? And I guess maybe for our listeners, like, should they care about this shift? I know, it feels like a big shift to have your data, quote unquote, leaving the device and going into the cloud. But from a privacy standpoint, I mean, does that really matter all that much? Should we be worried that Apple is kind of opening up this kind of, or going in this direction?
I think privacy is becoming, of course, important here. And, for a long time, Apple kind of sold us on the idea that, we make our own chip, we run everything on our own devices, and that's why, we're fast and private, and we charge this premium. And now they're quietly admitting that they couldn't do this for frontier AI, and they had to rent, the Google, cloud. So I think what I see here is kind of the mode here is the AI chips is also shifting from pure speed to trust. And I think NVIDIA, maybe they didn't win this slot just with the raw performance. Of course, they have, the fast chips, but it also, the confidential computing that Volkmar mentioned is really important here for them. And I think increasingly what makes AI chips competitive isn't just how many raw compute or operations you do per second. It's also whether you can prove that the data going through your chips stay private. And I think that was a very important thing for Apple, to make this chip. So because they can maintain, that privacy that they're claiming, and so that confidential computing that NVIDIA GPUs, they had to turn it on for them, to stay in that privacy mode. So, and another thing, this is telling us is if Apple can do this alone, this also tells us how brutal the frontier AI hardware has become. And that, I think, that's the part that I want people to hear. Notice
right,
here.
like even they can't do it.
Yeah, why NVIDIA got the slot, it just wasn't raw speed. It also was a security feature that encrypts the data while it's being processed. And I think this is also a big thing, a trend that we're seeing coming in the future. The value in an AI chip won't just be how many operations, as I mentioned. It's also whether you can prove the data going through it stays private. So I think those are really important directions that we're seeing.
Volkmar, maybe a final question to wrap this segment up is, do you see this as kind of Apple still trying to do both things, or are they're just sort of resigned to reality at this point? They're sort of like, we made it, took a shot at this, it didn't work out, and we're pretty much calling it quits.
I think that if the focus of Apple is really on consumer devices, and I don't see that consumer devices right now can justify the cost and the power consumption of HBM. High bandwidth memory is just very, very expensive. Like, supply chain is brutal. Apple is big enough that they can control the supply chain. But I think that from a consumer device, do you really want to have this 200 watt thing, right? If you look at the zoo of devices, it would only lend itself to the Mac minis or so, but it doesn't fit in the normal portfolio. So I think they will just, it's a very different memory interface if you have high bandwidth memory. It's different interposers, etc. It's very, very different chip design. And so there's nothing which fits the natural architecture which Apple is building. And so from their perspective, controlling that and actually putting all that investment in just to run a bunch of frontier models, I think they're better off just go with a partner. So I think it's a very natural choice. Yeah. So I'm not surprised at all. I think the main thing is frontier models, one, for anything that's complicated, and like smaller models go on device, and that's fine because, then memory bandwidth doesn't matter as much.
Kaoutar, I think you've actually been, do you want to put a final word in favor of small models? Because I know you've been a big advocate for that. And it seems like in some ways there's a little bit of a tension here.
Yeah, there is, it has to be like a tiered architecture. Like here, they have a 3-tier system. The easy stuff stays on your iPhone, handled by Apple's own small models. So the on-device pitch still survive here. The medium stuff goes even to Apple's own servers, the private cloud compute, running on Apple chips. But the hard stuff, goes to Google, where you're running this custom 1.2 trillion parameter Gemini model running, in Google Clouds on the NVIDIA Blackwell B200 GPU, so not Apple Silicon at all. And I think they didn't have a choice, like Volkmar said, so for all these hard tasks, you cannot really run them with today's hardware, on the on device. So I'm hoping maybe, further along, as, the efficiency metrics and also like how do you make these models smaller, more powerful? How do you make these chips also more energy efficient? Hopefully, maybe we can see shift back, but currently with the hardware standards and the way these chips are designed, like Volkmar, said it well, it's very hard.
Final story of the day. Our producer Alex flagged a fun blog post from a writer, Alice Gomston, about sarcasm in AI models. And I guess it will surprise no one who's a regular listener to the show that Alex immediately was like, this is a perfect segment for Chris to focus on. The story pertains to sarcasm in AI, and specifically this kind of interesting problem that we're running to, which is AIs are kind of bad at detecting when someone is being sarcastic towards them. And this is a really big problem if you want to use, say, AI agents for customer service, where people get frustrated and they are, in fact, sarcastic. I guess, Chris, I'll just let you kind of riff on this. I mean, maybe to kind of start you off with a question is like, is this a solvable problem? Can AI get better at identifying sarcasm? And what do we do about this?
Well, I mean, first of all, before we get into whether this is a solvable problem or not, I want to really quote the opening of this article, which was, Scotland is known for its majestic landscapes, kilt-wearing bagpipers, and literary icons. First of all, as a Scottish person, if people are thinking kilt-wearing bagpipers, that's where we're going in this, and literary icons, that's not what we're known for. We're known for...
Scotland is known for that. What do you say?
No, we're not. We're known for being drunk. We're being known for bad weather. You know what I mean? We're known World Cup. We're being known for being useless at football. You know what I mean? So maybe they're the things. So I just felt that was a whole bunch of... Anyway... For sarcasm, here's probably the thing that interested me the most about this article, and I think it's this one here. Is if I go a little bit further down. So they were saying that in order, not everything about sarcasm is in the words, and therefore you need to go multimodal for that. First of all, I kind of disagree with that. I think you can, with the use of context, you can really sort of work out whether something is being sarcastic or not without hearing the tone of that, right? So I don't think you need multimodal. But what I do want to say is, in order to detect sarcasm, it seems like the world's training data that it's using, the models are using The Golden Girls, The Big Bang Theory, and episodes of Friends to work out if it's good at sarcasm. Now, I don't want to tell you, but I think I understand already why LLMs are bad at sarcasm if that's its training set. So I don't necessarily think sarcasm is undetectable by large language models. I just think that perhaps The Golden Girls isn't the place you should be looking for that. And that would be my rant over on this. So, can large language models learn sarcasm? Absolutely. The Golden Girls is the best way for them to learn it.
But why, Chris, you think it's not multimodal? I still feel to detect sarcasm, you need also to look at the facial expressions, the tone, and lots of these things. I still feel, by just analyzing the text, it's not enough.
No, I get your point, because I think actually the thing is about context, right? So to the point there, in certain cases of sarcasm, you're relying on facial expressions, the tone, etc., which is additional context to the text. What I would argue, though, is that if sarcasm is done well, then the leading up context before that will give you the kind of the opposite effect. So you will be able to detect the sarcasm just on the response to the question.
The way these models work by predicting the most likely meaning of your word, and sarcasm is built to do the exact opposite. You say the words but mean the reverse, and you're counting on the listener to catch it. So the model's whole strategy, guess the obvious meaning, is precisely the wrong move for sarcasm. And if you look at the numbers today, most models land around 60-70% accuracy at spotting sarcasm. And I think it's fine on maybe neat textbook sentences, but it also can get lost in real conversation. So you can have really these messy gaps and back and forth between people when the people are actually talking. So of course, I feel like the real bottleneck is the data, not the model size. You need to have good training examples, which a lot of the text that was used to train these LLMs is missing, these nuances and so on. But I think adding the tone of voice, the facial expressions, the context, those are scarce in the existing training data.
So are you saying, Kaoutar, that in literary, there's no examples of sarcasm in any books?
No, there are examples but not a lot of examples, probably, mostly in videos and these podcasts and conversations. But probably in actual textbooks, I don't see there's a lot of it.
I think there is. I think sarcasm is fine in books. I get your point. There is context, and you're going to get more context from multimodal things, facial expressions, etc. I still argue that Golden Girls is not the place to get your sarcasm from. But, there is there's some perfectly good Scottish TV shows like Still Game that they could watch, and then they would understand sarcasm a little bit better. But what I'm saying
those are high value tokens is Scottish TV.
Exactly. But what I would say is,
I feel it's more on videos, right? Not in textbooks.
Yeah, any sort of book. So it doesn't need to necessarily be a textbook. It can be a novel. It could be a comic book. It can be whatever, right? But I think it's about context. That's my point, right? So, and I agree with you. If all you've got is the line before and the line after, and if the context and the difference between the two words is not that much, then you might miss that subtlety, and you need additional context. But I think you can get that perfectly within text. I just happen to think. But I get your point. Multimodal will make it easier, but not the Golden Girls.
I think sarcasm is all context, and the richer the context is, the better. And I think in that sense, I believe that, we will see that the multimodality will play a bigger role the more these models. I mean, right now we are interfacing with them, write me some code, here's a code base, right? And then maybe transcribe some text. And I think the moment we are enabling them to see, to hear, and then I think the subtleties will probably be better detectable. And so it will be more precisely do it. But I believe that I can be sarcastic on a text message, and the sarcasm comes through. So I think maybe we are really bad right now in good sarcastic training sets, because, I don't know, maybe the text messages are not trained in, right? So we need to figure that out. But I think multimodality is probably the way of making the models more aware.
what we need to do is go and get some unlicensed content from the internet and train it our models with that, because there's plenty of sarcasm within there. So that's the answer. Now, answers our earlier question as well.
All right, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm not sarcastic when I say Kaoutar, Volkmar, Chris. This is one of my favorite panels. Thanks to all you for joining. And thanks to all you listeners. If you enjoyed what you heard, you can get us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and podcast platforms everywhere. And we'll see you all next week on Mixture of Experts.